Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. I hope you're all doing remarkably well and loads of love to each and every one of you. And go and get that lovely hot beverage, coffee, tea, cocoa. It doesn't matter what you drink and whether it's sunshine or rain, there's nothing that beats a good hot drink. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Jackson and I'm from the southeastern state of Georgia, which spans the most diverse, picturesque scenic landscapes from pastoral farmland to statuesque mountains, dreamy forests, silvery lakes and coastal beaches. Our capital city is of course Atlanta, where I grew up as an only child to two very loving parents in the Virginia Highland neighborhood. I was raised in this historic 1900s bungalow in the heart of Atlanta's bustling commercial district, although back then it wasn't nearly as built up as it is today. Nowadays, properties in Virginia Highland are excessively pricey, but the area is still walkable, with many charming cottages and colonial revival homes, and is in close proximity to coffee bars, restaurants, boutiques, and so much more. Growing up in the early 60s, I would spend copious amounts of time with my cousin Lincoln, whose three older sisters had long since flown the nest and were settled down with families of their own. Lincoln was the unexpected late lamb, so to speak, as my aunt never envisaged falling pregnant again. My uncle was over the moon when Lincoln was born, as he had always longed for a son, but only ever been blessed with daughters, so Lincoln was like the quintessential gift from God, and without doubt my uncle's most beloved, precious and favoured son. My aunt and uncle lived on a rarely productive pecan nut farm, situated not far from Jacksonville, and as a child I loved spending time there with Lincoln, who was not just a cousin to me, but my very best friend, and ironically we looked so alike that we were often mistaken for twins. The family farm was breathtakingly beautiful, and in those days you would drive down some seriously precariously rough pebbly roads to get to the cattle gate, with a sign which read Pekin Hill Farm. You would follow the long windy white gravel road past magnificent groves of pecan nut trees on the right-hand side of the valley, and on the opposite side you would see verdant green hills and a large, splendid silvery lake that glistened in the midday sun and reflected the mountains and the trees on its sparkling surface, and was fringed on every side by some tall, masterful cedar trees that stretched back into a vast sylvan. Lying in the heart of the valley, like a jewel to this crown, was the prettiest farmhouse that you've ever beheld, that looked so magical, picturesque and enchanting that it could have been fictional, like something you would expect to see in an Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale. On paper it might sound possibly unremarkable, prosaic and mediocre, or even stereotypical if you like, much like other standard farmhouses you hear about, but you'd have to have seen this one to believe it. The prepossessing, bodacious, symmetrical farmhouse oozed character and total charm. It was 3 stories high and was painted in a pretty yellow colour, with a black slate roof and large white wooden frame French windows that overlooked the mesmerising panoramic views of the electric green countryside. It would appear that pretty rambling wild roses with open pink blooms climbed up the front wall of the home, trailing above the outer wooden panel of the white gleaming front door. Very classic-looking sandstone steps ran from the front door directly through a seamless French-styled courtyard that was framed with lavender bushes and sandstone tiles that supported terracotta pots filled with seasonal pretty flowers. Lincoln's father was a phenomenal farmer who could tell you everything you needed to know about pecan nuts and about the different varieties available on the market, not to mention the antioxidant power of a portion, as well as the calorific density due to the oil content of the nuts. One day he actually lit up a pecan nut for us with a flame, and it lit up like a cigarette due to all the oils in the nuts. He told me that pecan nuts at one time were given to pigs as a staple diet, and people who ate those pigs described the pork as having a delicious nuttiness to it, which I suppose makes sense. My aunt was forever making pecan nut pies, and also sold many at the local town. Apart from being a skilled, proficient farmer, Lincoln's dad was also brilliant with his hands, and as his son was the apple of his eye, He built him the most wonderful sizable treehouse with a little sign which said, "To Lincoln, love Dad." The treehouse was built around a very mature oak tree that was situated 50 yards in front of the woods that overlooked the bedazzling views of the statuesque mountains and the rugged rocky outcrops that hung over vast areas of the large silvery lake, like large layered flattened steps or platforms where you could sunbathe at will. The arresting treehouse possessed its own sweeping staircase that went right from the base of the tree to the cute little parasol home, which had its own wraparound porch that you accessed through the seamless sliding glass windows. We furnished the inside of our quaint little abode with a large comfy queen-size bed and a couple of settees, and regarded it as our quintessential little den or hideaway. The best part of it all was that from the windows you could actually observe indigenous wildlife like cottontail rabbits bounding over the area, marsh rabbits and deers, and extraordinary specimens of bird life that frequented the lake, like herons, ducks, and even the occasional eagle. One day when we were looking out of the treehouse window, we saw a young boy lying flat on his stomach over one of the higher, smooth, tabletop-sized rocky outcrops that jutted over the pretty lake at about a 30-foot elevation over the water. We watched in awe as he threw stones from a huge pile that he'd gathered from this great height, and he was trying to throw them in such a way that they didn't even make a splashing sound. It rather reminded me of the diving championships today, when the diver needs to jump into the water as seamlessly as possible without making much of a splash, which was similar to this game. We didn't ask ourselves the obvious questions at the time, like where did you come from, why are you on our land, or why do you look so different to us? At that age you just accepted things exactly as they were, without asking awkward questions. As like any normal kids, we just wanted to play, and that was always foremost in our minds. We ran down the sweeping staircase of the old oak tree, and in no time at all we were lying on our flat stomachs, throwing stones in the water next to our strange new friend, and trying our very best not to make a loud splash when the pebble did finally hit the water, which was a very big challenge at the best of times. We chose to call our new friend Winalot because he won almost every game we played, so the name kind of stuck. He was different to us in so many ways, but he looked remarkably human, only was covered in long flowing dark brown hair that had a pretty golden hue to it in certain lights. His arms were so much longer than ours, and his feet exceptionally large and padded, which meant he could walk around easily without getting snagged by thorns or briars, and he didn't seem bothered either by hot or cold surfaces. I do remember that communication was never a problem, as he used very expressive gestures with his hands, and his facial expressions were so easy to comprehend. I do recall that he occasionally spoke in a fast chattering tongue, with the occasional clicking sound incorporated that I've heard before in some African languages. Winalot could imitate the sound of every single animal in the woods. He could gobble like a turkey, squawk like a crow, and bark like a coyote. He was so agile, graceful and dexterous that he could pretty much climb almost anything, using his upper arms to manoeuvre himself from tree to tree, and his legs to swing himself up from the branches like a masterful acrobat. I do remember his movements were seamless. He made it look so effortlessly easy, and when we tried to copy him, we failed every time, as we didn't have his upper arm strength or nimbleness. Winalot would often climb to the top of trees and bring down birds' nests with little hatchlings still inside, and we would feed the hungry babies worms with our tweezers, and it was so much fun to do, because these fledglings were always so hungry. Winalot would then go and replace the bird's nest back on the tree in the branch where he'd initially found it. I do remember he did try to do this once to a crow's nest, but the nest was far too messy to retrieve, and the parents were incensed with Winalot, and perched at the end of the branch, squawking angrily at him, and flying around him, and even pecking him a few times with their beaks. You could tell they were far from impressed with him, and we found it hilariously funny to watch. It was always fun hanging around Winalot, but I only saw his mother on a couple of occasions, as she seemed so reticent, aloof and evasive. We could discern her colossal silhouette hiding behind the brush, and she would peer at us and make a whistling sound, articulating a few fast words to Winalot, who would go off with her and leave us to play alone. I do remember he loved eating my aunt's pecan nut pie, and he ate tons of pecan nuts and acorns and berries, but I never observed him eating meat, but I'm sure he did. One time when we were kids, I do vividly recall a very strange, peculiar event that all these years later I reflect upon quite a lot because it was so weird. In those days, crime was not the contentious issue that it invariably is today. But that did not mean that you weren't exempt from the random encounter with the occasional weirdo wandering around the place. One day my cousin and I were playing in the woods together, but on this occasion Winalot was with his mother collecting acorns and roots, as she had called him away from us earlier on in the morning. On this occasion a nefarious man approached us out of the shadows. I say that because we never saw him coming. He possessed a receding hairline and a silvery moustache, with piercing blue eyes. Looking back, he was a real insidious-looking character, but back then what did we know? To us he was just a man, nothing more or nothing less. Granted, he wasn't attractive at all, or not even remotely ruggedly handsome. But we were young, naive and gullible, and you could have told us the sky was green back then, and we might have believed you. Well, not quite, but almost. The tall, lanky man with his spidery physique may have been in his 30s or 40s, but in those days anyone past the age of 20 was literally ancient as far as we were concerned, so we considered him to be elderly. This disingenuous stranger should not have been on my cousin's farm in the first place, unless of course he was one of the hired workers that helped my uncle in the harvesting of pecans, which was a possibility, but my cousin didn't recognise him. I do remember this perfidious, guileful man behaved very strangely towards us and began to ask us all kinds of awkward questions about ourselves, like, "Where are your parents?" and "How old are you?" We answered all his questions wholeheartedly. Then this odorous man with his fake grin, in a nonchalant, casual way, asked us if we fancied a trip downtown to get some ice cream together. We were so enthused about this exciting prospect and began to eagerly follow the man back to his car, without even batting an eyelid, as such was the blindness of our innocence. All of a sudden we heard a huge, thunderous commotion. It sounded like a rhino was bolting through the thicket at an alarming speed, and this caused Lincoln and I to become incredibly apprehensive. Whatever it was, it made the most god-awful, horrifying scream, and the overwrought man grew as white as a sheet, and his eyes as round as saucers, and in his terror-stricken state he began to run away, looking over his shoulder with a spooked, aghast expression upon his face. All the while he was being pursued by this huge, shadowy giant, who we suddenly realised at once was Winalot's mother. We could hear the troubled man frantically racing towards his car, and struggling to open the door as his hands were shaking and trembling so much. I noted that his car had deviously been concealed behind a large hedgerow, so it couldn't be seen from our house. We watched in amazement as the man bounced onto the seat, slammed the car door behind him, frenziedly revved up the engine, stalling a few times in the process because he continued to shake. I watched in absolute horror as his tyres squeaked in his eager haste to get away. Winalot's mother threw a couple of large stones at the window, smashing the glass violently inwards, and it looked like his car had been hit by bullets. She chased his car all the way down the driveway, screaming as she went, and shaking her fists angrily. Those screams were so petrifying, they caused the very hair on my neck to stand up on end. I'd never seen anything like this before, because Winalot's mother was usually calm and down to earth, but on this occasion she was incensed with that man for some reason. I couldn't fathom what was going on at the time. We saw her fleetingly as she glided back through the woods, swinging her arms backwards and forwards, glancing at us ever so briefly, with a look of deep troubled concern in her eyes. And then she was gone. "Why did Winalot's mother have to be so mean?" piped Lincoln. "I wanted my chocolate ice cream." "Maybe she didn't want us to have any," I suggested. We were bitterly disappointed that Winalot's mother had chased the nice man away from us, who had promised me a great big scoop of strawberry ice cream. But now looking back, she may well have saved us from a nefarious predator with very devious intent. 5 minutes later my aunt was huffing and puffing as she ran into the woods, asking if everything was all right, and what on earth all the screaming was about. We shrugged our shoulders and said, "What screaming?" "You mean you didn't hear that raucous commotion?" she said. "It sounded like a woman being murdered." "We never heard anything," we lied. Fast forward to about the age of 15, and I don't actually recall playing with Winalot anymore. My cousin and I had become passionate about horse riding, and that had become the main distraction. We would go riding all over the countryside together, and our trips to the treehouse became less and less, and were trips to the stables instead. Lincoln's father had built us the most magnificent stable for the horses. One day my uncle rescued a horse that had been badly abused by some callous people who had treated her so badly by starving her half to death. The vet was actually amazed that she was still alive, as when she arrived at my uncle's farm, she was like a skeleton and was half dead. It seemed she didn't trust men at all, because her handler had been a man who had whipped her violently and treated her very badly. For some reason, Lincoln and I developed a close relationship with the horse, especially Lincoln, and he really bonded with her. She would follow him all around the farm like a lap dog. Lincoln called her Windsong because she had arrived at the farm on a windy day, and the wind began to whistle when she was led from the trailer to her stable, so the name just caught. It wasn't long before Windsong put on weight and developed into a very healthy, sizable mare, and I used to ride with my cousin regularly all over the countryside, down many of the local hiking trails with her. Everyone remarked on the bond my cousin had with Windsong. She was always skittish, though, around strange men. One day as we were riding down a hiking trail, a man was riding down the trail opposite us and shouting at us to get out of his way, which we thought was exceedingly rude of him, as he didn't have right of way. I remember his gestures and body language were very aggressive towards us. I guess he saw us as two kids and thought he could talk down to us in some way, in that frightful second that would ultimately change our lives forever in ways we could never have envisaged or imagined. The tone of this angry man's voice startled Windsong and possibly triggered memories from her abusive past. She began to panic and literally galloped down the trail at 100 miles an hour and became so frantic and out of control that my cousin was thrown violently off her back and thrust into the trunk of a hefty tree, where he lay on the ground, motionless. I remember the man had all but vanished, and Windsong trotted back towards my cousin and began trying to move my cousin's body with her nose, and I could tell the poor horse was distraught, because my cousin was most certainly dead. I'll never forget that moment, as I tried to wake my cousin up, but he was clearly gone and was beyond saving. I just remember collapsing into a heap of tears over him, and was fortunate enough that a lone female horse driver was riding down the trail, and she got off her horse and checked Lincoln for me, and also announced him dead, and went off to get help. Everything that happened after that is like a fuzzy blur in my memory, because I blocked it all out. Yet I do remember after Lincoln died, my aunt received a bouquet of wild flowers on the doorstep and a moonstone, and I remember her saying, "Where on earth did these come from?" I'm certain it was from Winalot's mother, and was her way of expressing her condolences to us. After my cousin's death, I was completely devastated and torn apart, because he was like a brother to me, and my whole world was shattered. My uncle was inconsolable with grief, because he loved the bones of his beloved son. For many long years I never returned to my uncle's farm, as my mother believed that my presence would only distress my uncle all the more, because my cousin Lincoln and I looked so uncannily alike, as we were like two peas in a pod, and almost like twins. "Don't send Jackson around here," my aunt had warned. "He's the spitting image of Lincoln. I fear if Jeremy sees Jackson, it'll tear him apart, because it will remind him of what he's missing, and I haven't got the heart to do that to him." "What about poor Windsong?" my mother asked. "How does he cope with her presence on the farm?" "That's the strangest part of it all," said my aunt. "Windsong and Jeremy have bonded. I think he feels connected to Lincoln through the horse. It would seem that they both need each other during this emotional upheaval, and that horse has quite literally saved Jeremy's life. They have an extraordinary relationship, as they both share the same grief, so it's like they're helping each other through this chaotic loss. I never knew animals could be this sensitive, but that horse understands Jeremy's pain and is his strength." "Wow," said my mother, "that's incredible." In the 1990s, my uncle and aunt decided to retire to the coast, and they handed over their Pekin farm to one of their daughters, Hilda, who was one of my older cousins. It would seem her husband took charge over running the farm. I was in my late 30s at the time, happily married with an 8-year-old son all of my own called Oliver. I contacted Hilda and asked her if she wouldn't mind if Oliver and I camped out on her farm, as I wanted him to see the places I had frequented as a boy with Lincoln. My cousin Hilda welcomed us with open arms, telling us it would be wonderful to see us both, as she hadn't seen us for so many years, since the tragic accident of my cousin's death. When I arrived at the farm, Hilda wept when she saw me, because even in my 30s, due to my baby face, I hadn't changed much, and looked hauntingly like my cousin Lincoln. "Oh, my word," she said, cradling my face in her hands. "My mother wasn't joking when she said you're the splitting image of Lincoln. It's like I'm seeing his ghost right now. Thank goodness I didn't invite your uncle around this weekend. I think seeing you would have torn him to shreds and reminded him of his terrible loss. Do you know, if it hadn't been for that amazing horse Windsong, Dad would have died of a broken heart years ago," she said. That afternoon, after a delicious lunch spent with my cousin Hilda and her family, I took my son to the wood green, where Lincoln and I had hung out as young boys, and all the memories invariably came flooding back like a mighty pounding wind, but of course in a very good way. "Where are we going to camp tonight?" asked my son Oliver, looking incredibly excited as he clutched his sleeping bag tightly to his body. "Why didn't you bring your tent, Daddy?" "I don't think we'll be needing a tent," I told him, as I made my way through the verdant wood green towards the clearing where the treehouse stood, on the old oak tree, overlooking the silvery lake and the mountainous valleys. "What's wrong, Daddy?" said my son, looking at my sad face as the salty tears began to pour down my cheeks. Even I was surprised by my emotional outburst as I stared at the treehouse that brought back so many haunting memories of my childhood, of the special time Lincoln and I had shared together, and the memories of our hairy friend Winalot. "Memories, son," I said, wiping away the tears from my eyes. "Precious, happy memories, that's all." "This is great," said Oliver, looking up at the treehouse in delight. "Are we going to sleep here tonight?" "That's the whole idea," I said, climbing up the sweeping staircase, with my son following behind me. I was astonished that from the outside the house was in remarkable condition, and I wondered if Lincoln's father had treated the wood over the years. It was likely he had done so, in memory of his son, I thought. When we got into the treehouse, I was stumped, as the inside of the treehouse looked like a large nest. The floor was decked with bales of hay that had been draped in animal pelts to make cushioned mattresses, and there was no sign of the bed or the old couches. There were a few tree stumps on the floor that looked like they were being used as random chairs, and there were 2 large pails that were filled with pecans and acorns. I immediately thought to myself that some kids had been messing around in our treehouse and disheveled the place. "Why is there hay everywhere?" asked Oliver, looking very surprised. "I'm not sure," I told him, "but I think we're going to have to clean it all out, and it's going to be quite a job. It could be a potential fire hazard." Before long, we'd swept the entire treehouse, removed the hay, and bundled up all the deer pelts into bin liners. I discovered that my aunt had surreptitiously squirreled away and wrapped up the old mattress along with the couches with bubble wrap, placing them in storage in one of the barns. So we retrieved them and replaced them in the treehouse, where they invariably belonged. That evening, after a delicious dinner with our cousins, my son and I retired to the treehouse. We laid out our sleeping bags upon the large, comfortable mattress and fell into a deep, tranquil sleep. It was at about 3 o'clock in the morning when I was suddenly awoken to the sound of heavy feet moving up the steps into the treehouse. And that was when I saw him. It was Winalot, my friend from years ago, now fully grown up with his female partner and his 2 younglings. He was so big now, it was almost intimidating to observe him, but I would recognise him anywhere. My heart just leapt with joy as I was thrilled to see him. Tears began to mist up in my eyes, and my throat became thick with fog because I was lost for words in my wondrous awe to see him. Winalot must have been about 9 foot tall, 3 feet across the shoulders, and 700 pounds, although now he had a beard and moustache, and his hair was long. His face looked much like it had done all those years ago, although it was broader and fuller, and his nose flatter and wider. For a moment we just stared at each other, and his face immediately softened as he recognised me. His eyes lit up at once, and I could see that he was ecstatic to see me after so long. His female companion looked alarmed and rather afraid, while Fearless, the rambunctious younglings, just looked curious and intrigued, as you might have expected. I immediately ran up to Winalot and I embraced him in my arms, and I began to sob and sob so that his hair became wet from my tears. He was so big, I couldn't even get my arms around him. But he patted my back affectionately for several times with his large hands, and made several joyful whooping sounds that he always made when he was exceedingly happy. His female companion began to chatter away garrulously, possibly asking him what was going on. Winalot pointed to me and exchanged a few syllables with her, and the female looked at me with a keen interest, and her fear subsided, and then she tapped me on the back like an old friend. I suddenly realised what Winalot was doing in the treehouse, where he would play with us as kids. It would seem that he had made this place his home, and everything made sense to me. My son Oliver was having such an amazing time as well. He was communicating with the two younglings by showing them his yo-yo, and they seemed fascinated, and before long they were all playing with it together. I could see Oliver was not concerned how different these critters were to himself, not unlike myself at his age. I knew Winalot knew the word "it's yours" from when we were young, so I pointed to the treehouse and to the bed and to the couches and said, "It's yours." He seemed to understand, and I patted him on the shoulders. Winalot squirreled away something from the rafters of the roof, and he pulled out a rose quartz, which he gave me, and I have treasured it for all these years, and have been told it's an exceptional piece. I spent the rest of the morning with Winalot, and we communicated in the sand by drawing pictures so that we could understand what we'd been up to since we last saw each other. We then went out to swim in the lake, and we splashed around in there for ages, having so much fun. And when the sun rose, we played our games with the rock, while my son was also having the time of his life with his two younglings. "I'm going now," I said when it was about 12 o'clock in the afternoon. Winalot looked sad to see me go, and so I took my son's hand and retreated down the staircase and made my way back to the farmhouse for a hearty luncheon. All these years later, looking back, I realised that Winalot was a Sasquatch. I became aware of this after all the coverage about Bigfoot on television. I know that Winalot would never harm a human being, but if a human was to encounter him, it does concern me how they might react to him, or that they could take a shot at my childhood friend, and that would grieve my heart terribly. Because I know he does look intimidating, but believe me, he has a heart of a great big soppy teddy bear, and if he saw you in trouble, he would rescue you in a heartbeat, and that I can assure you of. So there you are. That's my story. Thank you for that incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.